Welcome everybody. It is noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here with some information about the Natural Areas Association. We are a national member-supported nonprofit. We're over 40 years old. We provide networking, training, and advocacy for natural areas professionals. We also support your work in conservation and natural areas management by bringing you the latest science and best practice through our Natural Areas Journal, which is a peer-reviewed quarterly publication. We host regional workshops that give you a chance to get out in the field with your colleagues and learn together. We host the Natural Areas Conference, which is an annual event. And we also host webinars like this one. I encourage you to visit naturalareas.org to learn more about us or connect with a colleague who's a member. We have several upcoming events, including another webinar coming up next month, again dealing with using native seed. This time it's with Theo Witzel and Jennifer Ogle, and they'll be talking about the Arkansas Native Seed Program. So please visit our website, go ahead and register for that webinar and mark your calendars. We also had a webinar last week on aspen ecology and conservation with Paul Rogers from the Western Aspen Alliance. The recording of that video is now available on our website and our YouTube video, so I encourage you to find that if you missed it. It was a great talk, and it laid the groundwork for an interactive symposia that Paul's organizing for our Natural Areas Conference, which is coming up this fall. Speaking of which, this is the 47th National Natural Areas Conference that we'll be hosting. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this will be an all virtual conference, not in person. We had planned to be in the Great Basin this fall, but registration is open. We have over 100 presentations that will be available, including 7 organized and interactive symposia. I'll just note that Jeff and Francis, our speakers today, will be participating in a native seed symposium in the conference. And now I'll hand it over to our member manager, Amy Wills.
Hi everybody, this webinar is part of a series that is focused on the importance of native seed in natural areas management. And we're hosting 4 of these in 2020, and they're made possible and free of charge to you through the generous underwriting of our partners at the BLM Plants Conservation and Restoration Program, and also in-kind support of partners like the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. And we're fortunate here at NAA to be able to work with several partners to make webinars like this one today free of charge to you. But not all of them are underwritten. So we'd like to encourage those of you who find this type of programming valuable to become members of NAA. It's one of the ways you can support this organization, so we're able to continue to offer this type of programming to you. Obviously, times are changing for everybody, and while NAA is committed to offering important information and supporting our community, we're faced with the challenge of funding this work. So thanks so much to those of you who are members, and a really big thanks to those of you who joined while registering for this webinar. We really appreciate that, and we look forward to serving you and continuing to make your membership more valuable. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah for some more information about our speakers today.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, I'm happy to welcome today's speakers, Francis Kilkenny and Jeff Ott, are research biologists with the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho. They're part of the Grassland, Shrubland, and Forest Ecosystems Program and the Great Basin Native Plant Project. Francis is the technical lead of the Great Basin Native Plant Project. He focuses on developing seed transfer guidelines and modeling climate change impacts for important restoration plant species. Francis also studies the long-term ecological impacts of plant species used in post-fire rehabilitation seedings and fuel breaks, develops agronomic practices for native plant seed production, and synthesizes knowledge on the ecological and evolutionary processes involved in species invasions. Jeff has been involved with a variety of research projects dealing with vegetation ecology and ecological restoration in the interior West and beyond. His current research focuses on seeding techniques, seed mixes, and long-term effects of post-fire seeding in the Great Basin. He is also investigating landscape fuel treatments and adaptive genetics of native grasses. And with that, I'll hand it over to Francis.
All right. I want to thank the Natural Areas Association for putting this webinar series together and inviting Jeff and I to speak to you today. The main message we would like to convey is that post-fire restoration seed mixes matter. In this presentation, we will show that chosen seed mixes can last on the landscape and affect plant community composition and successional trajectories over the long term. We will also give you a sense of the trade-offs involved in choosing seed mixes based on suppression of invasive annuals, succession towards desired ecological conditions, and seeding costs. Before I dive in, I would like to acknowledge our co-authors, Danny Summers, Tyler Thompson, and Steve Peterson, and thank Kevin Gunnell, BLM staff, Utah DWR field crews, BYU field crews, and members of the 1999 to 2000 study. On the bottom of my slide are all the agencies and organizations that have supported this work, which are quite a few. The Great Basin, where the study we are presenting was conducted, is a large topographically and climatically complex region in the western United States. It is roughly 550,000 square kilometers, 75% of which are federal lands. Much of the Great Basin is arid to semi-arid, and the region's ecosystem, particularly the sagebrush steppe, face many threats. The primary threat is increased frequency of fire due to invasive annual grasses such as cheatgrass. Historical fire return intervals were around 200 years across much of the Great Basin, and now in many areas, fire return intervals are around 2.5 times the historical baseline. These ecosystems take a long time to recover from fire naturally, and due to repeated fires and other disturbances, these systems often lack sufficient native seed banks for recovery. So this region has been heavily seeded in post-fire treatments. This graph on the right from Piliad et al. 2017 shows that the majority of vegetation treatments have occurred, shows the majority of vegetation treatments that have occurred in the Great Basin over the past 75 years. This graph from Barja et al. 2020 focuses just on the post-fire seedings that have occurred in the western US over that same period of time. And this is, the last graph was just focused on the Great Basin. This one is all the west. And as you can see, there is a heavy concentration of post-fire seeding in the Great Basin itself. These graphs here from Piliad et al. 2017 show how seedings have changed over time. The graph on the right shows the increasing area seeded over time with a huge uptick since the mid-1990s. The large spikes are due primarily to seedings after fires. So when there are years with a lot of fires, you tend to see a lot more seeding. On the left-hand side, these graphs show changes in seed mix composition over time, particularly the balance between seed from native and introduced species. The gray bars represent non-native species and the black bars represent natives. For grasses, the top graph, native grasses only started to become a larger percentage of seed mixes than non-native species in the 2000s. Forbs and seed mixes in the middle graph are still primarily non-native in origin, and shrubs, the bottom graph, have mostly been native due to the heavy reseeding of sagebrush itself, although there has been an uptick in use of non-native shrubs in recent years. I want to note that even while more native species are being used in post-fire seedings, most seed mixes still contain non-native species such as crested wheatgrass, and very few seedings, even to this day, are native only. There are many potential metrics for success in post-fire seedings, including stopping soil erosion, cheatgrass suppression, and the recovery of forage for large ungulates. Unfortunately, recovery of historical, diverse, and desired ecosystem conditions, which is the primary goal of restoration ecology, has not been met in the Great Basin. This graph from Arkell et al. 2014 shows the estimated probability of sage-grouse occupancy in post-fire seedings that have occurred over the last several decades. Sage-grouse is an important umbrella species because it is heavily reliant on diverse plant and arthropod communities. What this graph shows is that seeding using conventional methods and seed mixes has not been successful in recovering sage-grouse habitat from fire. This leads us to the question, can seed mix design in the Great Basin be improved? To that end, our study compares the ecological effects of native-only seed mixes, which, as a reminder, have been rarely used in the past, but are more so recently, with the effects of conventional seed mixes, which also, as a reminder, include non-native species, over a relatively long period of time. When studying long-term effects of anything, it is important to have a good initial data set. In this case, we were fortunate that a research team led by Tyler Thompson installed this study initially and monitored the treatments for 3 years, which is the same amount of monitoring time that is required by both BLM and Forest Service policy. Their study was published in 2006. You can see the citation on the top there. I will be presenting on results from our first paper, which is the bottom citation, which compares vegetation data from 2002 to the data from our revisit in 2015. This paper was published in 2019. Jeff will be presenting new results from manuscripts that we are working on currently. So to give you a background, in 1999, the railroad fire burned portions of the Tintic Valley in central Utah, about 70 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. After the fire, the original research team worked with land managers to install seedings on BLM-administered land at 2 sites. One site, Mud Springs, is a higher elevation pinyon juniper woodland with 12 to 14 inches of precipitation. It's grazed by cattle, and it was aerially seeded. The other site, Jericho, is a lower elevation Wyoming sagebrush site with 10 to 12 inches of precipitation that's grazed by sheep, and it was drill seeded. I want to note that the seeding techniques were used based on the terrain at each site, and the study was not designed to compare those 2 techniques. Seeding was done in a randomized block design where seeding treatments were arranged next to each other within 5 blocks at both sites. The size of the seeding treatments were wider at Mud Springs, about 73 meters wide, than at Jericho, 46 meters wide, due to the lower precision of aerial seeding. Both were 213 meters long. 5 treatments, 4 total seeding treatments, 2 conventional mixes and 2 native mixes, and 1 unseeded control were applied at each site. I will briefly go through the seeding treatments in the next few slides. At each site, there were 4 seed mixes, a standard mix used by the BLM field office, a mix designed by ARS researchers with varieties that they had been developing, a lower diversity native-only mix designed by researchers from the RMRS Shrub Lab, and a higher diversity native-only seed mix designed by the Shrub Lab. You'll notice that the conventional mixes include both native and non-native species, though the ARS mix includes more natives than the BLM mix. While the native-only mixes, as their name implies, only includes native species. This is important because, again, at the time, no seedings were done using only native species. Also, while a number of published studies have reported on the performance of native species, most of these studies look at native species within the context of conventional mixes that include non-native species. There have been some studies on native species seeded singly, but not in mixes. And exceedingly few studies in the literature have looked at differences between conventional and native-only seed mixes. And only a very few have looked at this over the long run. Ours is one of the only ones. So this slide, I won't go into detail. It's just the seed mixes at the aerial site. But I need to point out that the seed mixes used in this site were somewhat different. In particular, several shrub species were added to the BLM and ARS mixes. Here are the detailed seeding rates for each mix at each site. I really don't expect anyone to absorb this entire figure, but I'd like to point out that the BLM, ARS, and native low mixes had roughly the equivalent total seeding rates. Whereas the native high mix had a higher total seeding rate, and that's mostly because more species were used and per species seeding rates were not adjusted. I switched slides early. That looks like. So this graph from our 2019 paper emphasizes the several major take-home messages. I will be going through this graph carefully, highlighting relevant sections and giving the data and interpretations on the right-hand side. So the x-axis is percent cover, and or the y-axis is percent cover, and the x-axis are different treatments, separated out by site and year. Each section of the graph from top to bottom represents a different cover type that we're looking at. And the gray bars are 2002, the black bars are 2015. So you can see changes over time. In the top graph, we're looking at seed mix perennials. And you can see a significant increase in seed mix perennials in all treatments. And it basically shows that there was successful establishment and persistence of all seeding treatments. The second graph is looking at non-seed mix perennials, so those that were not seeded. Few non-seed mix perennials show up in all treatments, except in the unseeded controls. So it shows that seed mixes strongly affect succession. So what you put in is what you get out, at least in this case. This graph is showing exotic annual grasses, particularly cheatgrass. And cheatgrass increased somewhat in the native seedings and quite a bit in the unseeded controls, whereas it didn't increase very much and was well suppressed in the conventional mixes. So conventional seed mixes are effective at cheatgrass control, which is one of the main reasons they've been used. But native seed mixes also suppress cheatgrass in comparison to not seeding. So I think that's an important point. Lastly, exotic annual forbs. Exotic annual forbs decreased in all seeding treatments and more so in the seed mix treatments. So having seeds that establish and plants that establish that you've seeded basically will decrease in exotic annuals. Seeding essentially is an effective control for exotic annual forbs. I'm not going to go into detail in this slide, but I did want to note that for each species that was seeded, we can decompose the data we have on cheatgrass suppression and separately show a relationship between cover for these species and cheatgrass suppression. And this will likely be in an upcoming manuscript. So lastly, I want to point out that there are significant compositional differences between the seed mixes and sites. These bars represent the relative percent cover of each species in each seed mix, site and year combination. It contains a lot of information, and I would really encourage you to read our 2019 publication if you want more detailed information. Beyond the obvious and expected differences between seed mixes and sites, I would like to illustrate that there was more compositional change over time in the native mixes than in the conventional mixes. To that end, I will give two examples showing how composition and dominant species have and have not shifted over time. So in this example from Mud Springs, the Mud Springs ARS mix, you can see that there has been some change from 2002 to 2015. The arrows show significant changes. So for example, Russian wild rye and Western wheatgrass increased in relative cover, while blue bunch wheatgrass and Indian ricegrass decreased in relative cover, with crested wheatgrass staying about the same as the clearly dominant species. But the magnitude of these changes were not high. This is in contrast to this example from the Jericho site native low mix. Here you can see that there have been high magnitude changes with relative cover of blue bunch wheatgrass and Indian ricegrass dropping precipitously and Western wheatgrass increasing greatly. These changes led to a complete shift in dominance from Indian ricegrass to Western wheatgrass. And in fact, Western wheatgrass became the dominant native species in all of the native-only mixes by 2015, and it also significantly increased in relative cover in the ARS mixes. Altogether, this indicates that successional changes of native seed mixes are more dynamic in this study than the changes in conventional mixes. And this will become more apparent in Jeff's portion of the webinar where he'll speak in more detail to the successional dynamics of these seedings. So I just want to do a little summary for part one before we move on to Jeff's portion of the talk. Seedings in the Great Basin have largely been unsuccessful in restoring biodiversity using conventional seeding practices. So there's a need for looking into other ways of doing things. Seed mixes have long-term effects on plant community composition. So what you put in is what you get out. All tested seed mixes suppressed invasive species, including the native-only mixes. And lastly, species composition changed more in the native-only mixes, indicating more dynamic successional trajectories. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff and let him finish up the talk.
All right, thanks, Francis. And I want to thank NAA for this opportunity to speak about this project. And all the other people who have been involved in this, as Francis showed, a lot of different people over different time periods have played a role. And it's been an interesting project, and I'm going to continue talking more about some other things we've looked at with this project. So we've continued monitoring. Francis showed up through 2015, and we continued monitoring through 2017. We'll be talking about two main topics here, successional patterns and restoration implications, and seed mix costs and outcomes per unit cost. So related to succession and restoration, these are some questions we asked. To what extent do burned and seeded treatments resemble natural communities expected to occur at these sites? Are treatments following successional trajectories towards a pre-burn reference condition? And what are the implications for state and transition models and restoration pathways? So to answer these questions, we needed to define what the natural or pre-burn or reference community was like. And then we use that as an idealized restoration target. But we know that there are a lot of possible ways to define a restoration target besides just this approach, but that's the direction we're taking here. So one way that we characterized the reference community was by looking at vegetation in unburned areas near these treatments. So here at Mud Springs, for example, there were these patches that didn't burn in 1999, and we sampled them in 2017. And from these photos, you can see that there are different amounts of sagebrush, pinyon and juniper trees at these sites. So this gives you an idea of what type of vegetation can occur at these sites on the long term in the absence of fire. But these are not what people would generally consider entirely natural or desirable as restoration targets, because there's an overabundance of woody species and depleted herbaceous understories, which much of that is probably due to the grazing history of these sites. So we also included ecological site descriptions as a source of information on reference communities, since we thought they might show something more natural and appropriate as a restoration target. Ecological site descriptions are a component of soils mapping that's been done by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. We downloaded soils data from the Web Soil Survey and identified ecological sites that occurred within 500 meters of the treatments. Each of the ecological sites has provisional data that includes expected species composition of the reference states, which we combined with our own data so we can make some quantitative comparisons. We found that these reference states had a greater abundance and diversity of grasses and forbs than the unburned vegetation we sampled. So we did some multivariate analysis, and here are some results. These are ordination graphs that depict the successional trajectories of the burn treatments in relation to these local unburned communities, as well as ecological site description reference states. So those are coded as UB and ESD in these graphs. Each of these points represents a particular treatment year combination shown by different colors and shapes. The ellipses show the standard deviations around centroids for each treatment. These graphs take the variation in community composition and condense it down to two main axes. So in both cases, axis 1 is correlated with similarity to the ESD reference, which is on the right side in both graphs. Axis 2 is correlated with the transition from the early period, 2000 to 2002, to the later period, 2015 to 2017, as you move up on that axis. And here's another version of these graphs where I've summarized the overall trajectories more clear. You see the centroids by each treatment and year, and lines that connect subsequent years within a treatment. So if you look at mud springs, you can see some patterns. These conventional mixes, ARS and BLM, are on trajectories moving in this direction on one side. The native mixes are following a different trajectory. They're closer to the reference dates, and the unseeded control starts out similar to the native mixes and then moves into its own space. Over here in Jericho, the treatments had a lot of similarity initially, a lot of variation, and then they became more distinct over time as you see these different trajectories moving in different directions. The conventional mixes are here on the left side again, and the native mixes on the right side. This is a graph that shows another way of summarizing these patterns. So here we're looking at the overall similarity of these treatments to these two different reference states, unburned and ESD, two different sites. And we've got this summarized for the two different periods. So each dot is the mean across those years and standard errors around that mean. And the y-axis here is the multivariate similarity to the reference. So the higher you're on this graph, the more similar in composition to the reference condition. And you can see there's several cases where there are changes between the two time periods, especially here. You can see the NH, NL, and USC increased, but the ARS and BLM remained mostly the same between these time periods. If you look specifically at the similarity to this ESD reference during the later period, there's a pattern at both sites where the highest is the native high followed by native low, unseeded control, and then ARS and BLM lowest. So that indicates that it was these native seed mixes that ended up being the most similar to this ecological site description reference state. So I'm going to talk about how these results relate to the existing successional models for these semi-arid Great Basin ecosystems. Here's a representative state and transition model for one of the ecological sites that was mapped at both of these study sites. And it captures most of the elements of the other ecological sites of these areas. And the general idea of these models, there's a reference state with different phases, depending on time since fire, and other natural disturbances. There's a current potential state that represents what you can expect because of current human-caused disturbances in exotic species. And then with further disturbance, you can end up with these more degraded states. Basin annual state often occurs after fire, sagebrush and Utah juniper state with depleted understories if there's a long time without fire, and other disturbances. And a common management solution is a seeded range state, which is shown here, as Francis mentioned. It typically has involved seeding introduced perennial grasses. And once this conversion has taken place, you can have increases of some native species such as wiry mixed sagebrush, or you might see this transition back to these other states. But one thing that this model and most of these other models didn't have was a pathway back towards the reference state and the current potential state. And this may be in part because, based on our knowledge of this system, we're not sure if this is possible, but I think it may also be that we haven't tried a lot to to implement this pathway. So would it be possible to facilitate this pathway through a more deliberate use of native species when seeding? And our results suggest that you could at least get partway there under circumstances similar to those at these sites. If you have enough time without another fire. I'm illustrating this by placing these treatments where they seem to fit best in this model. So the native treatments and the unseeded control are here on this interface between the invasive annual state and this pathway that's leading back to the current potential state. Depending on the site and the treatment, they're more on one side or the other. And then the other treatments you can see are positioned in other places, the other states in this model. So to summarize this section about succession and restoration, we found that both burned and unburned communities deviated from reference states defined by the ESDs as well as the unburned communities. Native and conventional seed mixes followed different succession trajectories. Communities arising from native seed mixes became most similar to the ESD reference states, and the outcomes differed by site, indicating differences in restoration potential. So I'm going to transition now to this other topic, thinking about seed mix costs. And this is something that developed because of conversations I've had with managers, where this is always an issue that comes up. And seeding treatments come with a price, and part of that is the cost of the seed itself. So we looked into these questions. What is the monetary cost of the seeding treatments? Specifically, how does cost differ among the seed mixes and the seeded species and varieties? And have costs changed over time? We have records of how much these seed mixes cost in 1999 when the seeding took place. And our colleague Danny Summers at the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources did an investigation to find out how much these same mixes would cost in 2017 by looking at what local vendors were quoting that year. So we've also got this question that is sort of a cost effectiveness analysis, or looking at return on investment, thinking about what is the outcome per unit cost for different potential measures of seeding success, including vegetation cover, cheatgrass suppression, and restoration of reference communities. So I'll show some stuff about that as well. So here's a graph that shows the seed mix costs and how they changed over time. You can see from these graphs, the aerial seeding here on the left, drill seeding on the right. Overall, the cost was higher in all treatments for the aerial seeding because of the higher seeding rates. It was also higher in the native mixes, especially the native high. But there was this, we found there was a decrease in the cost over time. Comparing 1999 with 2017, the cost of these native mixes had dropped because many of these native species have become less expensive during this time period. This graph shows that same information in greater detail. We've got the cost broken down for each species in each of these seed mixes, 2 different sites. And you can see the cost in the ARS and BLM mixes was low for all the species they used, a lot higher for some of the species, especially in native high, where more expensive seed was used at higher rates. But again, you can also see how those costs were going down for many of these species. But another way you can look at this is what was the outcome that you got for what you paid. So here I'm showing seeded species cover per dollar spent. So I took the cover of these species, it's averaged across the last 3 years of monitoring, and it's divided by the cost per hectare. And it shows that some species had a lot of cover for the amount you spent on it. Basically the species that became well established and were also relatively inexpensive, like crested and Siberian wheatgrass in the ARS treatment. crested, pubescent, smooth brome in the BLM treatment, and western wheatgrass wherever it was seeded. Western wheatgrass is the only native of those I just mentioned. And you can see again how its value on this axis has increased between 1999 and 2017, where some of these non-native species have decreased. Another way to evaluate the cost effectiveness of these species is by their contributions to cheatgrass suppression per dollar spent. So here the y-axis is what I'm calling the suppression index divided by cost per hectare. This index is a measure of the negative relationship between the seeded species and cheatgrass. It's derived from those models that Francis showed quickly a little while ago. It turns out that these values weren't very high at Mud Springs because there wasn't as much cheatgrass and the relationship wasn't as strong as at Jericho. Jericho, you can see that there were certain species, which in most cases were the same ones as the previous slide, that were most cost effective for this purpose of suppressing cheatgrass. And then tying this into that community analysis that I presented, here's an evaluation based on how well the cover from these seeding treatments matched up with cover of the ecological site reference states. So this is seeded species percent of reference state cover per dollar spent. In this case, because the non-native species weren't a part of the reference community, their contribution is 0, or it could even be considered negative. And the value of the native species, including those that were more expensive, becomes more apparent. And again, I'm using the ecological site description reference state as a point of comparison, but the same analysis could be done using some other restoration target. So the purpose of this is to illustrate possible ways of evaluating the success of seedings within a monetary context, which is something that is important and managers tend to think about. And that concludes my part of this presentation. So I think at this point, we open it up for questions.
We've got Chris asking, are Jeff's data from the OTT 2019 paper, or is there another paper?
The part that I presented hasn't been published, but we're working on getting that out.
Okay, so there'll be a publication forthcoming, so keep an eye on that. Any other questions from the audience? Angela is asking, how long were the seedlings rested from grazing after seeding? Were there objectives related to density and or cover for livestock grazing to return, or simply a number of seasons of rest to return livestock grazing?
I can answer that generally, and maybe Jeff can give some more specifics if he has them. But generally, grazing, the seedings are rested for a couple of years. And yes, there are targets specifically for available forage. So they look specifically at the return of grass species. Grazing can be kept off longer if there isn't recovery of grass species.
All right.
Jeff, do you want to answer specifically about this study?
Yeah, there was a couple of years of resting from grazing, and after that grazing resumed, these sites are grazed, and that was one of the management objectives in these seedings.
Okay. Dustin is asking, do you have estimates on seeds per square foot on native versus introduced, both drilled and broadcast, the percent emergence that you see?
Well, the data is available for that. I don't know that we have calculated that particular metric, but we know the seeding rates, and we have at least establishment over long term. Because we have the data from 2000 to 2003, we can talk about early establishment and then long term cover increases. but we don't specifically have those specific measurements or metrics published, but they could be derived.
Okay. Corinne is asking, in what instances would you recommend not seeding if non-native grasses are present?
You mean present in the system already or present in the seed mixes? And are we talking about cheatgrass, annual? I'm just not completely sure what the question refers to. Are we talking about annual non-natives that are invasive?
So Corinne, go ahead and type in a clarifying comment there. And in the meantime, I think we'll move on to another question. They're coming in faster now. Are future native seed mixes that include a high diversity of forb species going to be evaluated in the future?
Yes. I think all of this is, we're just at the beginnings of really trying to understand more complex seed mixes. The conventional mixes have been fairly similar to one another over time. And there hasn't been a whole lot of change relative to what's possible. There certainly has been change, and managers have definitely been creative in cases. And it would be valuable to look at some of those. But, and there are folks looking at past seedings, but also setting up experiments and putting in comparable treatments into restorations would be extremely helpful in the future. And we're part of at least one study that's looking at seeding diversity in mixes that we have going on in the Snake River Plain. So that also looks specifically at forbs. And so that's yes, the answer to that question is yes, and I think there will be a lot more in the future.
And this is a related question from Hannah. Can you talk about why forbs have been historically excluded from seed mixes?
I think a lot of it has to do with what has been available on the market and the focus on the grasses being the dominant part of these systems, and grazing probably comes into that as well. In this particular study, the seed mixes were just grasses and shrubs, partly just based on some specific management concerns about this site. They were concerned about an invasive forb that they might have to treat with herbicides. But forbs are definitely, there's definitely a lot more interest now about including forbs in these seed mixes.
Okay. We have a question from Chris. Is Western wheatgrass less palatable to cattle? Is that why it increased? Because cattle or sheep ate blue bunch and rice grass because they were more palatable?
There might have been an interaction in that case. Certainly, we know that blue bunch wheatgrass and Indian rice grass are quite palatable. They're considered ice cream plants, so the cattle will go after them preferentially. I'm not completely sure whether Western wheatgrass is less palatable. One thing we do know is that it's probably more tolerant to grazing. It grows differently than a lot of the bunch grasses do. It can actually spread rhizomatously, and so it tends to be able to continue to reproduce even after being significantly grazed. So we think that maybe that has more to do with it. Also, it can probably continue to reproduce even in bad seed years when there's drought.
Okay. This is a question from Owen. He says, was the population level info on the native species preserved, and did you look into how many of them were from the same seed zones as the seeding area? He says he suspects at that time most were from mismatched seed zones, and he asks, would you expect a seed zone match native only mix to perform differently than the all native mixes used in this study?
You want to answer that, Jeff?
Yeah, that's a good question. These seed mixes used at this time were just based on what was available on the market, and they were from seed zones basically outside of, of this area. And so that's a important question, whether that could have contributed to this pattern we saw, that some of these species weren't as well adapted over the long term as they could have been.
Okay. Mary has a question. Do you report the extent of diversity species specific and the establishment of species that are present that were not seeded?
Yes. So we have non-seed mix species that were recorded in the vegetation transects, and all the species that were recorded go into the successional trajectory models.
Okay. And another question from Corin. Burned landscapes that have moved from the reference state to an invasive non-native annual grass state, then they burn again. Are there any instances you would not recommend seeding for BEAR or ESR?
I think that's possible. So there are areas where there is significant loss of the native seed bank, and there's significant continued pressures. And I think that would be a question for managers to determine kind of a triage level. There is work that has been done by Gene Chambers and others with resistance and resilience modeling, and you can use those models in a triage approach if you want. We think that there are ways to restore even quite degraded landscapes, but the cost could be quite high. And so it's certainly a trade-off to think about when you have a situation where the costs and the likelihood of success are lower. Whether you want to seed those with something like crested that'll just keep the cheatgrass out. So it's a good question. I don't think there's a specific answer. It really is going to depend on case by case, but it's absolutely true that the cost will be much higher in those more degraded landscapes.
We have a question from Dusty. Have you done any research specific to south-facing slopes on burn areas specific to early cereal species mixes?
Not us. Ali Urza and Gene Chambers and others published this study right at the same time we published it, looking at also comparing native-only mixes to conventional mixes. And that study was different. It was a little bit larger scale, and they looked at differences in slope characteristics and aspect, I think, as part of that paper. So,
okay.
Urza et al. 2020. Sorry, 2019. I don't remember the journal that's in.
Okay, we have a question from Kathy. She's asking strategies just jumped to seeding western wheatgrass or other species needed to facilitate its eventual establishment.
So it sounds like the question is, since western wheatgrass was so successful, and we should maybe focus on that. I guess that's one possible interpretation. If you do want to restore, the diverse community, you may need to focus on finding those successful varieties for a particular site and strategies to get things established. But western wheatgrass, according to this study, was something that was among the native species, the best for these sites.
Okay. These seed mixes, were they, so Jeff, you've said that these were developed with basically the seed that was available, but Sally's asking, were they sort of aimed at grazing animals, native herbivores like sage grouse?
These are areas, there was a focus on wild ungulates, big game, the participation of the Division of Wildlife Resources with this help push things in that direction. So that was one of the focus for some of these, using some of these species. There wasn't at that time a lot of sage grouse stuff going on, so I don't think that factored into this as much.
Okay.
I do want to just add to that because I did introduce in the beginning the fact that recovery of sage grouse habitat has not been very successful. And that probably has a lot to do with the choices made in terms of what to focus on. And that said, having a trajectory towards an ecological site that is a desired condition, these ecological site descriptions should be supportive of sage grouse habitat. So even though the focus in this case was not to develop sage grouse habitat, that trajectory is a positive sign. And we think with the addition of forbs and other plants to the mix, and possibly also looking at more adapted natives that we could potentially really have a stronger and more rapid recovery towards those conditions.
So Francis, I think you at least partially answered Heather's question right there. And her question is, since native seed mixes are more expensive than the non-native mixes, what are the incentives to plant the native seed mixes? Just a more natural community. But it sounds like that these more native seed mixes are really important for that sage grouse habitat recovery.
I would say a little bit more. Yes, sage grouse habitat recovery is kind of the focus given its potential threatened species status. I mean, it's a species of conservation concern, and it's continually being evaluated by Fish and Wildlife Service to see whether it should be considered a threatened species. That said, sage grouse is really an umbrella species, and because it is dependent on biodiverse systems, if you have sage grouse habitat recovery, you also have recovery of habitat for multiple other birds, pygmy rabbits. It says I'm muted by the host.
Yeah, I accidentally did that. I apologize.
So you have, with sage grouse recovery, you're getting recovery of an entire system. So that would include all the plants. It would include many other bird species, pygmy rabbits, lots of arthropods, pollinators. So essentially, without those diverse systems, you're losing all of those animals. And these diverse systems are what supports functional ecosystems. So I would say in the long run, we should think about it in terms of trying to increase biodiversity, and that biodiversity supports functional and resilient ecosystems that are resilient to climate change and other disturbances over the long term.
Okay, great. I'm just scrolling back through the questions to see what we've missed. So there's a question from Hannah related to what you were just saying, Francis. I think, are reference sites necessarily the ideal landscape state to restore back to, when oftentimes they represent habitat that has been historically impacted by grazing, fire suppression, and pinyon juniper encroachment?
But what we did in using a couple different types of reference states, I think illustrates that there are different ways of developing a restoration target. And as I mentioned, the vegetation that we actually sampled on the landscape had these issues that were just mentioned, long-term grazing and other things that have modified the vegetation structure and composition. So the ecological site descriptions are designed to show what we think was the pre-settlement or more pristine state of the vegetation. In not all cases you would think of that as your restoration target, but it's a good starting point. So that's kind of the approach we've taken.
All right. Well, I think that we will call it there. Thank you, Francis and Jeff, for sharing your research, your ongoing research. Thank you to everyone who attended. We appreciate you spending time with us to look at the outcomes of native seed mixes and non-native seed mixes in post-fire restoration. And we invite you to check out the Natural Areas Conference that's coming up in October. Again, registration is open on our website, naturalareas.org. We'd also like to thank the funder, the Bureau of Land Management, for their support of this and several other webinars. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.